Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope we gave you just long enough to get a glass of water, begin to think about the implications of the Climate 100 index. This session, the conversation that we're about to have with Dambisa Moyo, Chris Goodall, and Andrew Griffith is the natural extension of what we found in analysing that data, in that you bump in to what we call the good miner problem, which is how do you judge the efforts of companies that by their nature are deeply part of the climate problem for reasons of history? Do we give more credit to companies that have greater impacts but are changing rapidly over companies, if you like, that are part of the new economy and might have less of a footprint and therefore can burnish their net zero credentials more easily? And I am alive to the fact that there is an irony in this a newsroom called Tortoise having quite such an obsession with speed that we are really more focused than ever on how fast companies are changing, because the central question, I suppose, for this coming hour is whether or not the accelerating rhetoric of companies around net zero is really being matched by their changes, and whether that's being driven by customer behavior, by financial expectation, or by law and regulation. We have an incredibly impressive group of people joining us, and I have to just say, I really don't take that for granted. Chris, Dambisa, and Andrew, thank you for making the time to be with us. Is a very busy time, and so I appreciate that enormously. Just to introduce everyone, Dambisa Moyo. Dambisa, over the years, I've covered business for very, very many years. I always feel like you're on the board of everything. That in the end, actually, it's easier to just say, actually, has been on the board of pretty much every interesting business I can think
I'm
of.
only on 2 boards. I don't know how you
Not
land
over
there.
the years, Dambisa. I remember there've been many, many more. Andrew Griffith, who actually is also one of those people who I knew from a business world. There were, back in the day, Andrew, working in Sky, these things must have seemed much more in your control. It now feels as though you are so directly involved in so much of the interaction between what the UK government is doing and business. So it's really helpful to have you here, particularly given your role around COP and net zero. And Chris, I'm going to embarrass you here, but actually, internally in Tortoise, we look at the things that you say and what actually you think is the agenda for delivery on the net zero objective as a sort of, ordnance survey map of the issues. So we're particularly pleased to have you here live. So thank you very much indeed. Dambisa, can I start with you? Let's start, if you like, in the boardroom. What is driving the change to business behavior? Is it customer expectation? Is it finance? Is it regulation? And are any of those things sufficient?
Well, thank you so much for hosting me. I'm delighted to be here today. I don't think it should be any surprise to anyone who allocates resources, by that I mean capital or labor, that the usual drivers of change are at play here. And by that, I mean everything that you've just said. So customers, public policy, of course, and to my mind, technology. You haven't mentioned technology. I've been very carefully listening to what your introductory remarks. I mean, innovation and technology are a huge part of why organizations do what they do in terms of allocating resources. I would put onto that, when we say public policy, I think there's a sense, and perhaps a somewhat incorrect sense, that it's driven by punitive regulatory change, when actually I think a huge driver that's missing from this debate and many other debates in ESG space is that corporations are very often driven by necessity. A classic example of this is just what we saw and we witnessed with respect to COVID-19 response. And so with respect to energy, corporations, and we're focused, your question was about corporations, but do remember that over 80% of the energy that is produced is by state-owned enterprises. And so we are talking about the necessity for people to increase their livelihood, ability to go to school, ability to have access to quality healthcare. All of these are contingent on energy delivery, and so in that respect, all these factors matter enormously.
But Dambisa, do you think that the first session we had this morning was with Nigel Topping, and his point to us journalistically was, don't underestimate exponential change. And do you think that we are misreading the direction of corporate travel, i.e. that our starting point, and perhaps this is just inbuilt journalistic skepticism, our starting point is that there's too much rhetoric and there's too little change? Do you think that actually what you're seeing in companies is the beginning of something exponential, and we should expect, taking on board your point about technology, a scale of change in the 2020s that makes us much more confident by 2030 that we'll hit this 2050 target? Are you quite optimistic in that sense?
I don't see why you wouldn't be. Innovation has been the backbone of society's evolution, time and time again. Just yesterday, listening to President Biden's address to Congress, he made the point that technological change over the next 10 years is likely to be faster than the last 50. I'm not saying that we will get there, but I don't a priori assume that the glass is half empty. And I don't know why people do that. I know I serve on the board of a large global complex organization. I know what we're doing, and you should too, because we publish a lot of information in a separate document, and it's not just us. Every single energy company views this very much as an existential crisis. We are publishing information about what we are doing, not just in traditional fossil fuels, to mitigate the downside. So things like CO2 intensity, greenhouse gases, et cetera. But we're also showing very explicitly what we're doing to the upside, which is what matters. We cannot grow our way economically and continue to expect human progress without investing in energy. And we are doing that in water, in solar, in battery, in geothermal, in biomass, in nuclear Gen 4. You have to appreciate, James, that we're 8 billion people on the planet. If we had an answer, if someone on this planet had an answer to how we can deliver energy in a cost-effective and in a sustainable way, we would know that answer. This is a complex problem that requires innovation. And I think this notion that, oh my gosh, we're doomed is a very surprising thing, particularly as someone who was raised in Africa and lives in the West. The West has traditionally been very optimistic about solving complex problems, and yet the narrative just continues to be glass half full. Oh gosh, it's doomsday scenario. I would actually be a little bit more optimistic. And the dates may move, but I do think we should be more optimistic.
And can I just ask you one sort of slightly personal thing, Dambisa, which is Chevron, right? You have, I teased you at the beginning about being on a lot of boards. The truth is that you do have experience. You have, I suspect, choices about which boards you serve on. When you chose to serve on the Chevron board, there's an implicit judgment there on the impact of that company and the potential of that company to change overall impacts on emissions. How do you personally make a judgment of whether or not that company is doing the right thing, is making the transition fast enough?
So it's been a no-brainer for me. I have to say, just to underscore this point, I happen to serve at a very, I think, an extremely interesting crossroads. And you are correct. I serve on the board of a large energy company, but I also am on the investment committee of Oxford University, the endowment for the university. And I was born in Africa. There are 1.5 billion people on the planet who've got no access to energy. I know, having lived in the West for a long time, we tend to take a very narrow view of these issues. From my vantage point in the areas that I'm interested in, I've written on, this is ultimately about economic development. So yes, I'm very interested in what innovations are taking place to in terms of CO2 capture and all as I said, these risk mitigation strategies. But I also recognize that most people, certainly on my home continent and around the world, cannot just dial into a Zoom call. what has happened in the last year has actually materially altered their trajectory and their living standards. And we don't want to talk about that. And by the way, we're not going to be able to solve this problem without having the Chinas, the Indias at the table in a constructive and meaningful way. And we're being asked to force people to make this trade-off in lives versus livelihoods. And I think that is a very big missing piece. And I know the conversations that are being had, not just in the private sector, but also in public policy and as well as in endowments. And I feel very optimistic.
Dambisa, thank you. I think it's really helpful. Some of these things that already just in your first remarks about state enterprises versus private sector, technology versus regulation, consumer behavior, and this big question, I think, around climate and, if you like, developed versus developing economies. I'd like to give ourselves room to get into some of those issues, but I want to just, if we can for a moment, focusing on the UK, and Andrew, I'll ask you about this. This is going to feel like a trick question, Andrew, but it really isn't. Is it the case that, actually, if you look at the direction of travel over the last decade, the UK has actually gone from being a country perhaps best known for North Sea oil to being one in terms of its commitments and its changes on coal, to being a genuine leader in terms of what we are aiming to deliver on net zero?
Yeah, it's you've asked me a nice question, James.
I've asked you a nice question because
it does feel like a trick. I was the cynic in me, who beats out regularly, was waiting for the gotcha, and I'll try and answer it in a balanced way. Look, I think the UK clearly has come a really long way. Okay, particularly in the energy transition from renewables, and that should. I mean, I loved what Dambisa was talking about, and we should have huge confidence and optimism from that. By the way, let me know if my sound doesn't work on.
Yes, you're great.
I'm good. So there's clearly more to do. I'll give you a few examples. I mean, you've obviously seen the degree to which, we're about to turn off coal. I mean, literally the last coal-fired power station will cease to burn in a matter of months or weeks from now. The commitments that the UK government's made, and they're not reckless, they're underpinned by what they see, what I see from the UK business community. I've literally 5 minutes ago, I was with a group of top UK businesses looking about how we can accelerate the transition to EVs, another domain. We've done, a lot in energy. There are other domains now to work in automotive. The UK is a clear leader. I mean, we're going to be turning off the ability to buy a new internal combustion engine car in 2035. I think that's 10 years quicker than France and Germany. The decarbonisation commitment that the government's recently made in Carbon Budget 6, that is not the German government position. It's the platform. The same level of ambition is the platform that the German Green Party are running on. And you and I are probably roughly the same age, so we'll remember that pedigree of the Green movement in Germany, really making a lot of the running in Europe over the last 3 decades. They're now running on a platform that would see Germany catch up with the commitment that UK has made. And a German child today will be finishing university before Germany burns its last coal power station. 2038 is the target. We'll be doing that. We'll be completing that journey in months and weeks. In Germany, Europe's biggest single economy that's always had a strong tradition of environmentalism, they'll be burning coal on the current trajectory until 2038. And that's underpinned by the sort of dialogue that we have with business. So that is not to say there isn't a great deal more to do. And exactly as Dambisa said, this is another industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution, played out over 150 years. For 2,500 years, since we came out of caves and lion cloths, we have built a human society. All of the wonderful technology and the prosperity and the increase in human life that we've existed, we've built all of that around carbon energy sources. I'm very bullish. I think over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to unplug ourselves from that carbon infrastructure and plug in whole new sources of energy. and we're going to do it in decades, not in centuries.
And Andrew, so let's say that we actually do allow ourselves, given the kind of inevitable skepticism there is around progress on this, and given the fact that all of the global data points to a transition that is just too slow, that is in danger of being too little too late. But if you take the case that actually the UK's overall commitments underlined last week, your point about combustion engines, switching off coal, all points to a genuine momentum within the UK, the two sort of follow-up questions that come from that are one about systemic change and the other about global change. I just wanted to ask you about those. So the systemic change is that we're trying to have our cake and eat it. Forgive the obvious analogies. The cake and eat it analogy is we still want to have global growth. We still want to have increased living standards, that the consumption economy will continue, that actually no politician is willing to put that on the table, but it has to be on the table if we're going to meet these 2050 commitments. What do you think of that?
I don't accept that macro trade-off. I accept there will be micro trade-offs. There will be changes in behaviour and changing in the way that people use resources. We happen to frame this around things like energy, but water is a huge scarce resource. It also has implications for energy generation as well. But I don't think you can really resolve humankind's ambition and our ingenuity and our ferocious capacity to solve problems to make life better, and say that that's not compatible with solving this problem. I mean, you look in the small issues that we have solved in the past. Solved is an overstatement. I accept that. I don't want to get shot down. But we've had Clean Air Acts. We've dealt with issues about, or tackled, sorry, is a better way of putting it. We've tackled issues about CFC emissions. We've tackled the acidification of our atmosphere, which was something that we lived through. When I was a young geographer, it was always about acid rain and how we were going to deforest the northern hemisphere. Now, I'm not saying there were magic wands and that those have all gone away as an issue, and the world does have this big existential crisis on climate, but we will solve that, and we'll build businesses on the back of that.
I mean, the reason I wanted to raise that with you, Andrew, is you'll see it, or you probably won't, but as you're speaking, there are quite a few people in the chat who are making this point that we have to reframe our expectations of the way our economy works, the way our society works. I'm going to bring in some people in a moment. I'm going to turn to Chris Goodall on this too, but I also would like to kind of just get your view on the global point, which is, and you'll have heard this countless times, which is, yes, this is all very well, Andrew. I know that what you're doing is very important, but it doesn't really matter if the big emitters, China, India, etc., are continuing on the trajectory they're continuing upon. And what do you think about the extent to which, in effect, even if you buy the argument that countries like the UK and the US have finally got religion on climate, it's a failure of global leadership and global coordination that's really the problem here?
Well, we're all each other's supply chains. I mean, when all I can talk about is when I I'm in my little domain. Okay, I'm talking to leading UK businesses, and I want to try and make that real. But their supply chains are in China. They are in India. They are their scope 3 reductions, and the biggest contribution that we and they can make is by developing and bringing forward at scale the new technologies that others will adopt. I mean, China is in many technology areas, they're actually ahead of us. So they're doing more stuff in hydrogen today than we are. They've always had a significant renewable component, and if you're either a cynic on this, which I'm not, partly because I can see under the hood maybe more than the media can, but to Bisa's point, it's all there in the data. I mean, the quiet revolution that is coming is the mandatory carbon disclosure, because you can pick any multinational wherever they're headquartered in the world, big multinational companies who are agents of change. And you'll be able to look through that data and see what they're doing in India, see what they're doing in China. Mm-hmm. So I don't really sort of believe in that unilateral sense that it's just us, but the today forward action is for the UK to be making, as it is, the credible commitments, and then using its position of global leadership as G7 presidency. That's the jeopardy, is if we don't use our leadership well, then we may not achieve those points of change, but I think we will.
Andrew, I know that you have to get on just around 10:30, so I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I want to bring in Chris, and I'll bring in a couple of people who, as you were speaking, have kind of points of view to share with you. Chris, will you just pick up on the point that Andrew is making, which is about, and the subjects that's supposed to be the focus of our hour, which is corporate behavior, and if people have read your book, What We Need to Do Now, or your latest book, or last year's book, I should say, actually, there is a real focus on what big businesses can do. What's your read of what those multinationals that Andrew was just talking about are actually doing in this area?
James, a lot of progress in the last year, no question about it. A really significant change inside those companies. I get to talk to not the leaders like Andrew does of these companies, but the people working in the bowels of the large companies, and there is a genuine sense that those companies are changing. And there's pressure from employees to make that change faster. That's underestimated. A lot of these companies are going to have difficulty recruiting and retaining people unless they become more explicit and more coherent in the way they plan to reduce their emissions. There is also, inside the companies, cynicism, no question about it, about the speed of change and the commitments that are being made. Companies in general do not seem to realize just how difficult this transition is going to be for them. There's no question about it. This is one of the most difficult things that has ever happened. It's going to change consumption patterns dramatically. Virtually no companies are ready for that yet. There's some foot dragging going on. There's some feeling that the returns available to companies in low carbon fields are simply not equal to the high carbon alternatives that they've got at the moment. And therefore, I don't see, although there is exponential growth, it's exponential growth at a relatively low rate from a very low base. Much remains to be done. And yes, the UK has done very well on electricity over the last 8, 9, 10 years, no question about it, as a result of targeted government policy, particularly carbon taxes and other tools which are available in the government's ammunition armory. But on things like transport and heating use, we're actually going backwards. There is absolutely no signs of change as yet, either from companies or from individuals.
And Chris, what do you attribute the rate of change? There was a period, I suppose, about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago even, where we were beginning to hold these think-ins. And when you got a CEO, in the room or on the screen, you'd almost invariably hear the phrase, well, when I speak to my children, right, they say to me, right? And there was something clearly that was cultural that was changing. And then since then, you've seen obviously a good deal of change around ESG. You've seen quite a lot around the politics of listening to your children is not going to be enough to make the kind of structural changes you're talking about. In your judgment, what are the levers that make for meaningful change here?
Look, I trained as an economist, and I'm afraid every economist you will ever speak to will say exactly the same thing. And I'm sure Dambisa agrees with this as well. A carbon tax a universal global carbon tax would be really helpful at pushing companies into the right frame of mind to take a significant action. It's not popular. It's politically very difficult. It would be very difficult to get organized on an international, global basis, but it's absolutely something which is required, and it will only help companies. Sorry, Andrew. Sorry, James.
And Chris, what do you say to those people? Because I was asking Nigel Topping about this earlier today, who worry that a carbon tax is a false god, in the sense that it's like asking for a global set of rules on regulating the internet. Is hugely desirable, but almost overwhelmingly unachievable, and we waste up too much time thinking about it.
Well, what people are investigating now, of course, is not just not a simple global carbon tax, which is probably impossible, but carbon taxes within regions, for example, the EU, combined with carbon border controls. That is to say, if you wish to import steel from China and that steel has a high carbon content, there is a tax imposed at the border as that steel arrives inside the EU. That will be the way it first begins. There's absolutely no question about it. And I think the EU is very much in the lead on that. And I think, personally, I would be very optimistic about this being achievable.
Okay, well, that is very good. Chris, that's very good to hear. I'm going to start bringing just a few people in, because I'd love to get your perspectives on things and put them to Andrew and Dambisa and Chris too. Dominic Brown was making a point. Andrew, your point about I don't buy the macro story, but I do buy the micro story. And this was, I think, Dominic was making some points about some of the areas around greening our homes and buildings. Dominic, you'll make the point better than I will. So put it to Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. I work in climate change.
Dominic, apologies. I think we just... Oh, there you are. You're back. Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. Three of us working on Zoom today. I work in climate change, and education and helping change consumers' behaviour, I believe, is going to be a key factor in reducing the nation's carbon footprint. I just wanted to understand, considering a recent scrapping of the Green Homes grant scheme and reduction in the EV grant, several of both of those have actually hit me as I tried to live a greener life, want to move to an electric vehicle, and now sort of priced out of that with a large family and a large car. How do you envisage bringing consumers on board through policy changes? What's the government's strategy in light of those recent changes to the policy?
Andrew, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Look, the reduction in the you can still hear me. The reduction in the automotive piece has followed down the cost of electric motoring. So I'm not the policy guy, but it just you can now get into electric motoring at a very affordable price level. So if you like, it was an intervention that has, in my view, worked very well. There's great demand now in the market. There's a lot of publicity. You've gone from niche manufacturers to every single mainstream manufacturer, and the price point of getting into an electric vehicle has fallen radically, absolutely radically, in ways that people would not have predicted even 3 or 4 years ago. There are different interventions now in the market. One of the perceptions is that there's not enough charging points in there. And so there's a lot of support now going into how do you deploy more charging points as demand builds. So, I mean, you're going to see, I think, clearly as a net zero champion, I want as much resources and help as possible to accelerate us on this journey. But you're going to see touches on the tiller with the government interventions. There's more money macro going in than there was before. And they want to try and target that in the best way possible. The Green Homes grant, I suspect I agree. I mean, we need, the money's been redeployed into the public housing sector, which is probably one of the most difficult to abate environments. It's got some of the worst legacy emission characteristics. But I'd love to see, and I suspect we will see over time, a new intervention that's perhaps a little bit simpler than the Green Homes grant was. And that feels to me, it's not quite nudge economics, but definitely the government has a great role to play in smoothing out some of the friction for people to change their consumption habits.
Andrew, I'm aware of time. I want to ask a question that's been one of the themes of today's summit already, which is around ESG and finance. And it was a question I wanted to put to you and Dambisa, which is, there now seems to me to be one of those kind of herd moments that you see sometimes in business, where everyone piles on and says, look, we're purpose-driven companies, we are interested in our environmental, social governance performance, but there's not agreed standards. And I wanted to ask you, if you like, with your old Sky CFO hat on, if you were trying to get to a world where you had the same requirements on your environmental reporting and your financial reporting, who would you look to set those standards and enforce them?
Well, actually, we are moving to that world. There is a mandated taxonomy of carbon disclosures. The government's making that mandatory. So the biggest private and public companies, that will be a mandatory requirement in very short order.
Sorry, I should know that, Andrew. So what's the timetable on that?
I think don't quote me, but I think it kicks in 2022. Okay. It's coming fast, and it's not a choice. Companies over a certain size.
All companies over a certain size have to report.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And what do they have to report? What will they have to report?
They will have to report their carbon emissions. So they have to report a absolute magnitude number that says this is how much CO2 I am releasing into the atmosphere. So it'll be just like you have your turnover figure and you've got your director's pay. There will be a disclosure around precisely what that company's carbon footprint is.
And who audits that?
Well, it'll be part of the audit profession. So there'll be either specialists or mainstream audit firms that will do that. And those are science-based targets, standards. So they're not bespoke. They're not something companies themselves come up with. And a lot of this already exists, James. So a lot of this is already out there. If Dembisa's on the board of Chevron, they will already be doing this because this already applies to the largest companies.
Yeah, but I'm intrigued by the idea that I get my auditor in to do my financial report, but also understand that they're also going to have to then either contract out someone who is going to do the auditing of the emissions or have that capability themselves. But is that what I understand is correct?
Yeah.
So it's essentially you're taking the task force on climate related financial disclosures for the financial sector and moving them across all kinds of business.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And it will become a prerequisite for raising any form of capital. I mean, I'm sort of with Chris, to be honest. I think the most potent force is employees, because employees are great agents of change, and private enterprises are essentially voluntary enterprises. In a market, people can work for who they want. But this is a really, really powerful tool. And, and again, it's, just like we're changing the carbon as the mitochondria of the global economy. Actually, we're creating a new taxonomy so that just as much as we talk in pounds and pence when we talk about measuring companies, we will be able to talk in terms of their carbon footprint.
So I will, Andrew, thank you. My colleague Luke Bedimer, who is really, as I think you saw from the last session, in the weeds of the details on this, is going to try and do the job of just getting us access to exactly what that policy is, so that people who want to understand it can get detail of it.
Sorry, I can't chat and talk at the same time.
No. I understand that. But Dambisa, do you want to pick up on that? What do you think about how we standardize and enforce ESG performance so that it really bites?
Yeah, so, I think Andrew has already said that this is already in train. I'm actually sitting here thinking, am I living in a parallel universe? This work is already being done, it's already being published. I think the questions around the tip of the spear is how much utility do these metrics have across companies, which obviously they differ in terms of their structure. How do they stand up across sectors? I mean, that's really where the discussion is. And obviously, I believe both Andrew and Chris have mentioned, there's obviously a broader macro construct here, which has to do with the global imperatives. Is everyone at the table? We've seen, even with something like a vaccine, where you'd think that governments would come together, not just autocratic and democratic, but even within democracies, you would have hoped that they would come together. And we've seen massive failures in terms of coordination. And so this is yet another massive public goods problem that needs to be addressed. And I think there's still, there's a huge amount of work from the rating agencies. Andrew mentioned the auditors. I mean, we're already doing internal audits on this type of area without guidance, by the way. We don't have a broad global construct that says this is how you're supposed to do it, but companies are already doing that.
But Dambisa, sorry.
Work to be done in this space.
But Dambisa, that's exactly the point that I'm making, is that my worry in this area is that the history of greenwash, inevitable public suspicion of large companies, and a global shifting marketplace of how these emissions and these environmental impacts are measured means that there's inevitably this view that, yes, companies are telling us what they're doing, but in fact, they're marking their own homework. Oh, sorry, your side. No.
Sorry, yeah. So I don't quite understand again where this cynicism is coming from, because the truth of the matter is there's $45 trillion that has been earmarked for ESG. Okay. Yeah. And, yes, it is no doubt about it. As a board member and as someone who serves on the board of an endowment, I am interested in the returns. We're not here to waste money just in the pursuit of goals that don't have any long-term sustainability. We are backing an agenda. And I said ESG. I mean, we've been focused here on the E. There's a lot of other aspects here. There's the S and the G that is also incredibly complex. But, this notion that somehow, nothing is really being done, there's sort of let's just play nice and report some low quality stuff. It's just not true. There's so many.
No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying.
It sounds like you're saying that there isn't a back, that people aren't putting their back into these efforts.
No, sorry, they're two different
things. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you.
No, they're two different things, Dambisa. One is, yes, there is real cynicism out there, right, for obvious and understandable reasons, because we've had a history of big companies for a decade now talking about sustainability, but global emissions have just kept on rising. So there's a justified suspicion there. And secondly, the fact that there's been such a movement of capital behind quote unquote ESG investments so quickly without the corresponding change in corporate or personal behaviors leads to people thinking, well, how much of this is just the rebadging of, what were, investments in the old world to quote unquote ESG investments in the new world. So I think there is real suspicion. And then there's a second area, which is, yes, even companies that are really doing the good work, because there's not a globally agreed and enforced set of standards, how do we as consumers judge who's doing good, very good, or really outstanding work? That it's very hard to be able to judge that.
Yeah, look, I mean, so sorry if I misunderstood you, but fundamentally, if you're asking me, are there constraints to how far we can go because there's no global agenda? Of course, to me, it's like the vaccine. To the extent that we can't come together, you're going to see a split between Europe and the UK. Yes. What is the ideal scenario? The ideal scenario is global coordination, more transparency, more information in terms of what actually is possible. There are an array of solutions that are being explored with gusto. As far as I'm concerned, and I think it was either Andrew or Chris who made the point about this really being a zhuzhed up industrial revolution, which we will, I do think, achieve in less than 150 years, but it does take time. And it is a complex thing. It is not just, if it were easy, somebody would have done it already. And so, yes, I agree with you. There are sort of ideal equilibria that would be nice to have. But even in the world, the second order world where we're living currently, there is enormous progress. And I wish people would be less skeptical and more sort of engaged in the areas that do seem to be working and not so cynical on the downside.
Dambisa, thank you. I'm just going to, Andrew, before you go, I know your time's running out. I just want to get David Wood to make this point. Have you got 2 seconds, Andrew, or do you have to run?
Yeah.
Do you? David, you had a point both about tech, but also about the sectors that Chris mentioned, some of these areas, transport and heating. Do you want to put the point to Andrew?
Yeah, so I want to be sure that we're not understating the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from a different source. We've talked a lot about heating buildings and how we're making progress. We talked a lot about changing how we're generating electricity and even about transport. But by some measures, 31% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from manufacturing. Every time we manufacture cement or glass or plastics or fertilizer or steel, a lot is emitted. And it's not just CO2, it's CH4, methane, or N2O, nitrous oxide. And I don't see anything like as much progress in addressing these. And I do worry that if we're excited, as we should be, about improvements in solar and wind, that we'll get a bit complacent and we won't realize until too late that we're still emitting far too much greenhouse gases by these other means, and we won't have enough solutions in place, and the game will be over. So can you reassure me that UK companies are actually addressing this source of greenhouse gas emissions as well?
Yes, I can. But I don't. I mean, look, I don't want to be glib. But there is capital being. Look, things take time, right? I mean, opinions we can change overnight. The manufacturing processes take a long time. It starts with the demand curve. Right now you cannot get enough green steel. There is a demand curve for green steel. People are demanding buildings that are net zero carbon in construction, as well as net zero carbon in use. That is driving a demand both for new methods of construction and new materials. And it takes time to repurpose the supply chain. It's a relatively novel intervention. We wouldn't be having this conversation, I think, about 5 years ago. Now we're having it. I think it's pretty mainstream. The conversation I was having immediately before this was about a dearth of electric vehicles, commercial vehicles. You just can't get them. There's a global shortage. If anyone here is looking for stock tips, go and invest in a company that's making commercial electric vehicles, because with over a third of the FTSE 100 in the UK now having signed up to 1.5 degree science-based targets to halve their carbon emissions by 2030, this is the exponential effect. This is how it works in the real world, is it goes from the boardroom to the corner office to the executive team. There are fleet managers for all of those large companies right now looking at their 2023 vehicle orders and discovering that there isn't yet the manufacturing capacity to create those electric commercial vehicles. And in those electric vehicle factories and in the boardrooms of those automotive manufacturers, they're sitting down now saying, gosh, something less polite version of that, what the hell are we going to do? We need to repurpose our factories at pace to move away from combustion engine vans to electric, because all of these big companies who are our demand curve, who are going to be placing those orders, are not going to be placing orders for those ICE vehicles. So it's happening in real time. There is pure green steel being made, powered by hydrogen, created here in Scotland. There are aluminium. Aluminium is, I don't know, I won't go beyond my competence on the other gas emissions that you talked about, and clearly there'll be separate work stream on those. But aluminium, if you think about it, is a hugely energy consumptive manufacturing process. Mm-hmm. But businesses are looking at creating green aluminium right now. So I would just say the wheels are turning. It's a little, it's not trust me, because there is real tangible money flowing, orders being placed, factories being built. But we're pretty early in this new industrial revolution. And if you wandered around the United Kingdom during the very first industrial revolution, 2.5 years in, you'd still think it's all about sheep, not about iron ore.
So, Andrew, thank you. Listen, I realised that we've imposed on your time that you had to get away at 10:30. So thank you for staying a little longer. I'd also just point you, Matt Jones, whom I don't know, but has kindly shared a note from Linklaters, which was an interpretation of the Chancellor's statement on these environmental standards rollouts. The FCA imposed for financial companies for the beginning of 2021, and the target is to make them mandatory, at least as I understand it, from 2025 for companies across the board. So just to, please click on, anyone can see that. Andrew, thank you for your time. We will, I want to continue, if I might, just by picking up with Jenny Lawrence and Mark Haywood, because Chris Goodall, I wanted to point this to you. One of the sort of new terms of art that you hear these days is about not green companies, but greening companies, i.e. those companies that obviously have a fossil fuel or heavy energy footprint, emissions footprint legacy, but are really making the change. And, you know, Mark Carney talked a fair bit about this when he came on a few weeks ago, saying we do need to actually focus on the rate and scale of those transition companies. But it's very difficult for us as consumers sometimes to be able to read exactly how far and how fast those companies are going. And Mark, I wanted to hear from you, because you were talking about the standards point that that Andrew's made, and Jenny had made an interesting point about consumer behaviour and commercials. Mark first, and I'm going to hand back over to Chris.
Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, I'm just really worried about the way that people are talking about the role of private sector auditors in this process, because the record, both in the UK and in many other countries over the past few decades, is really quite alarming when you look at the ability of auditors to remain independent of the companies whose accounts they audit. And that's when we're talking about financial information. If we're going to carry on relying upon auditors, these very big, powerful companies who run an oligopoly, to then monitor and evaluate the accuracy of reports about ESG progress, we are getting into a whole new level of unreliability unless something is done to put in place some monitoring authority with real teeth to ensure that they are doing their job better than they have done in the case of Enron, Carillion, and lots of other big companies all over the world, particularly in the developed world, of course. And it seems to me, therefore, that to get the progress on ESG properly monitored and effective in the precious little time that's left, we have got to have a simultaneous revolution in the auditing profession if we're going to rely upon auditors to do that job.
Chris, do you want to respond to that? And Jenny, I'll come to you in a moment if I might. Chris?
Yes, very briefly. I completely agree with that. And the point needs to be made also that none of these measurements have any form of scientific rigor to them. Most of the things we're talking about that compose the carbon footprint of a company are not yet rigorously scientifically based. We cannot actually say what the scope 1, scope 2, and particularly scope 3 emissions of any particular company are. So to hand the responsibility of checking the accuracy of something to independent auditors, inverted commas, independent, close inverted commas, auditors, is, in my view, it's likely to be completely hopeless and ineffectual. And I did want to also...
Chris, so Chris, what would you do? Sorry.
That's really stopped me in my tracks, hasn't it? Well, I think, first of all, we do need to get much deeper understanding of the causes and the volumes of emissions that arise from the activities, particularly the purchasing activities, not the internal ones, but the supply chain of the companies that we're talking about. That means more research, more agreed standards, and we probably need, instead of giving it to independent auditors, to use a specialist who are able to take much more objective views about whether a company's stated emissions and the change in those emissions are actually correspond to reality. It's a new trade. It doesn't exist in large volume at the moment. There are people who can do it for you, but for most of those companies, they'd be far too small to do it for BP, for example, today. So a difficult transition.
Chris, just as you, Jenny, I promise I am coming to you. It's just that as Chris was talking, Dambisa was both smiling and shaking her head. So I don't know what that meant.
Well, I don't know if you wanted Chris to respond. I mean, I think that's exactly the point. I was smiling because it's deeply infuriating when people are sort of throwing stones and then don't really have a concrete, measurable, transparent proposals to say, hey, but what about this? And I think Chris is right, and Mark is right, that it is wholly dissatisfying to say we'll just have the auditors do it. We all know the limitations of audit. We're also, another very big agenda from ESG is worker audits that are emerging, which have traditionally not been done. And so there's a lot of these areas where we think under this ESG frame that there's work to be done. But I think before we throw the proverbial stones, let's do the work of trying to figure out what those alternatives are. I don't think you'll find it hard to find consensus across, political views or different views on, across the spectrum on, consensus that there are issues. The reason I was sort of moving my head around was because, nobody comes up with real proposals or real solutions. I shouldn't say nobody, but it just feels incredibly fragmented. Yeah. And very often there's so much verve and energy in tearing stuff down, very deconstructive, but much less so in terms of saying, hey, listen, I don't think we're going to agree on everything, but here are my 10 crazy ideas. Let's get blood from a rock or water from a rock, so to speak. But that was really what I was reacting to.
But the implications of what both you, Dambisa, and Chris are saying is that if the standards are set and the expectations are set, there is the potential for a whole new industry of environmental audit and, in fact, whole ESG audit to grow up. It may or may not be the existing financial audit services firms that provide it, but there's an industry that's got an opportunity to start from scratch, or more or less scratch here.
In principle, I cannot a priori say, no, that's not the case, or yes, that's the case. All I'm suggesting is that is one possible solution. There are rating agencies. It may be something that exists. One area that boards are deeply reliant on now in terms of employee response is technological. So platforms like Glassdoor, like Blind, like The Layoff, we're getting a lot of information we didn't have because we're living in a world where those platforms didn't exist. Well, now they exist. I mean, I can't foretell what the world is going to look like in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, where there may be a very, very transparent and reliable alternative to the audit option. But what I am saying is that at a very minimum, that to me, that is on the table, something that it could be an alternative to the audit function that we rely on for other audits already. So I'm eternally optimistic. I like innovation. I really believe in that. I believe in it. It has bailed us out before. Going back to the 1700s with Malthus, it's going to bail us out again. And therefore I never say that is definitely not the answer unless I really have hard data to back it up.
Dambisa, thank you. Jenny. Eventually, I chiefly wanted to come to you because anyone who can bring Will Ferrell into a conversation about anything needs to be brought in at all times. But you were making a point, as I understand it, about customers, consumers. What are you thinking?
Well, I just think, at the moment, brands are taking a risk in communicating their commitments that they are taking to move to sort of lower carbon emissions. And I think it's quite interesting because, obviously Volkswagen, their carbon emissions scandal a few years ago was a big learning curve for the automotive industry. And I think that the fact that now you're seeing ads talking about, Will Ferrell in his ad for General Motors the fact that they communicated that on the Super Bowl, that is a huge opportunity, first of all, to promote EVs, but also to bring up that conversation about why consumers aren't, why consumers should start thinking about this from a demand perspective.
Dambisa, do you want to just respond to that? What you think about the kind of shift in the way in which big corporates, particularly US corporates, are thinking about their relationship with the customer, and the extent to which environment carbon is a point of competitiveness and differentiation now?
Huge. Absolutely huge. One of my favorite examples actually comes from about 7 years ago. I was in Singapore. It was before sort of ESG became as in vogue as it seems to be today. But I sat on a panel with the CEO of Olam, O-L-A-M. A lot of people in the West don't know Olam. Olam is one of the largest food producers in the world. Even at that time, they had developed an app called Olam Inside, which could basically focus on what we're talking about here, which is provenance, which is this idea that you can go into a restaurant, swipe across the menu, and there will be information about the hamburger that you're about to order. It will tell you what the CO2 emissions were, how much water was used, what the average wage is for the people that are producing this food, so it could be in front of you. This is the world we're going into. And by the way, these are live conversations in boardrooms. Like, wait a second, we're producing these goods. Very soon, you won't need to wait for some auditor to tell me what the emissions are. You'll just use the iPhone or the mobile phone that you have. You'll be able to swipe over our products, goods and services, and get that information and make judgments. So this notion of provenance, and we talked about employee pressure, but even putting that aside, the idea of provenance and data being available is huge, and it is a differentiator.
And Dambisa, can I just ask you, I know we're running out of time, but Ali Bohani, and I would have brought Ali in, we're just very close on time. So I'm just going to read you his question, because we've talked about ESG, we've talked about consumers, we talked about regulation, but this is about a question for the board. And Ali asked, as a board member, would you oust a chief executive who introduces, quote, climate adjusted earnings at your board level and champions ESGs at the expense of growth, or a flat share price and lower dividends than expected for 3 years? And he says it's an honest question. And you saw, I'm sure, the case of the chief executive of Danone, who'd made a lot of these commitments, but wasn't delivering financially. What's your read of what's happening around boardroom tables on that balance between finance and environmental outcomes?
So it's a wonderful question, because it is difficult. I'm not going to pretend that it's not. I mean, if you look in the United States, corporations are registered under Delaware, majority of them. The Delaware regulation is behind the Business Roundtable proclamations that you want to move away from financial primacy into more stakeholder primacy. So this all sounds like gobbledygook, but fundamentally corporations have been set up to not be the government and solve these ESG issues. That is changing for sure. But I will just make the point to this point about whether we would remove a CEO because of lack of performance. That is not the world that we live in. Meaning that we continue to want to see financial performance. These companies have to survive. They have to continue to invest. They are to my mind, really, they're going to be driving the innovation in this space. But we also can't support underperformance because there's a cost of capital to their employees to satiate, etc. So I would say that it's a complex mix. Investors have a big role to play in this. If investors, by the way, when we talk about institutional investors, we tend to think of them as being sort of Larry Fink and far away. It's our money that's in these companies. It's pension fund money. It's endowment money that, our taxes. And there must be much more opportunity, I think, for government to say, wait a second, from now on, all UK pensions have to put money in infrastructure or in environmental considerations. They don't do that. And to me, that is a huge missed opportunity for where we as individuals can influence and help not just the board, but corporations more generally to achieve these ESG goals.
Dambisa, thank you. Chris, do you want to answer that question too, whether or not you think the balance is, I really appreciate Dambisa's point about the Delaware requirements on financial performance and the UK fiduciary responsibility requirements. Chris, what do you think? Is the balance shifting, or is the experience of the Danone CEO really a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks that financial performance is still not the kind of dominant measure of what matters for boards and their investors?
Yes, of course. In modern capitalism, financial performance means everything. I think in the case of Danone, the performance had been bad. He had underinvested in marketing. He hadn't done the kind of things that Paul Pullman had done so successfully at Unilever. So I don't think we should read too much into that. Lastly, James, may I just make one comment to differentiate my views, if I may, from Dambisa, as I think it really comes to the heart of this. Dambisa said, and I think I've got the quotation right, innovation is going to bail us out. And that appears to me to be an illusion. Massive change across the whole of society is going to be required. Our consumption habits are going to change. For example, we're not going to be able to eat meat. We're not going to be able to eat flying. It is no good large companies saying, don't worry, innovation has worked in the past, it'll work in the future. That really produces a complacency, which I don't think is appropriate for the severity of the situation.
Chris, thank you very much. There is a view about what a newsroom is, or a newspaper, I was taught, was an argument on the way to a deadline. we are re-engineering that to be the argument at the moment of the deadline. So we leave this conversation in the spirit that we set Tortoise up in, which is civilized disagreement. So Chris and Dambisa, thank you for joining and for being part of that civilized disagreement. Thank you everyone for being with us this morning. We are actually, fun enough, going to go directly from here to a conversation about technology and innovation, about whether or not pure clean energy is anything other than a fantasy, or with the genius of engineering, a real prospect in the coming decades. Thank you, Dambisa Moyo. Thank you, Chris Goodall. Thanks everyone for being part of this conversation.